Hey everybody, Mauricio Raoul here, founder and CEO of Premier Law Group, also known as the Anti-Lawyer. And if you found your way to this video, it probably means that you at least have some interest in asset protection, in securing your hard-earned wealth and protecting those assets that you spend all your lifetime accumulating. And as you should be. Asset protection these days is no longer a luxury for the rich, it's something that everybody should worry about. Because we've all heard the statistics, right? Everyone knows that the United States is the most litigious country in the world, with over 90% of all the lawsuits happening right here. That equates to over 1.4 million lawsuits every year. That's about 3,800 lawsuits every day, 2.5 lawsuits every minute. And when it comes to lawyers, it doesn't get any better. There's about 39 lawyers for every 10,000 Americans. So what that translates into is that you have a 1 in 4 chance of getting sued sometime during your lifetime. And that number just gets higher if you're a business owner or a physician. So think of it this way. Let's take a look at your average wealth plan, where this is where you are today, and this is where you are at death. And this particular life plan comes from my good friend Tom Wheelwright over at Provision. But essentially, let's say it takes you anywhere from 5 to 15 years to accumulate your wealth. And then this is the rest of your life. So most people think about this as a straight timeline, from where you are today to really where you want to be, and then to death. The reality is, your wealth plan looks a little bit more like this. Where as you're going along, you're going to get sued. There's going to be a lawsuit in your life. And if you don't have an asset protection plan in place, you're going to fall through that gap and either go all the way back to the beginning or lose substantial time. And God forbid something happens when you're retired or you're in your rest of your life phase, then the results can be catastrophic and you've got to start working again. So the purpose of asset protection, really, the way you want to think about this is just putting a plan in place so you have a safety net so that if you get to those lawsuits, instead of falling all the way through and coming back, you catch it right here and protect your wealth as to the most you can. So what do we do about it? Well, we can start with some very basic asset protection concepts. So in asset protection, what we're trying to do is really 3 things. So here's you, and here are your assets. Let's say you own a property or you're a business owner. What we're trying to do quite simply in asset protection is we want to create a wall or a barrier between you and your assets. And with my clients, what we're always looking at is we're trying to do one of 3 things. The first situation that we're trying to address is that something happens to your assets, whether it's a tenant who gets injured on your property or it's a business dispute, but it's a lawsuit or a dispute happening to your properties, or to your assets, and they're trying to come to you to collect. We want to make sure that this barrier is there. So we're looking in this situation to limit your liability. We're limiting your liability so that they cannot get to you. We're protecting you from your assets. The other situation, though, that most people don't think about is what happens if you get sued irrespective of your properties or your assets. Let's say you get into a car accident or you get into some dispute where there's a judgment against you personally and now somebody's coming to look to see what they can collect on. And this is what we call asset protection. They're trying now to get to your home, they're trying to get to your business, and we've built this barrier so that it can't get to it. So we want to protect you from your assets, and we want to protect your assets from you because you're probably the most dangerous person out there. And then third of all, we want to protect you from Uncle Sam. So with those 3 things in mind, let's take a look at some strategies that we can implement to make sure we cover those 3 aspects. So let's talk about insurance. I always recommend my clients have some level of insurance in place for their asset protection plan. It's always your first line of defense. That means if you've got some rental properties, you want to make sure you've got some property insurance, but also some liability insurance. And if you're worried about getting sued up here, you may look at some kind of an umbrella policy. The issue with insurance, and this is kind of my beef with the insurance industry, there's really 3 things that really get to me when it comes to insurance. Number 1, there's so many exclusions in an insurance policies that you really don't know what you're getting. So there's examples time and time again where people are making their premium payments thinking they're insured, but when it comes time to actually collect because of an injury, you find out it wasn't insured. And to be honest with you, I even have a hard time reading an insurance policy and trying to figure out if your particular issue is coverable or not, because they're sneaky. They'll put that some things excluded in the first paragraph, they'll put it back in paragraph 25, and then at the end they'll take it back out. So that's probably my biggest concern when it comes to insurance, making your premiums, thinking you're insured, but it turns out you're not. The next issue I have with insurance, which is less with the insurance companies, is that most people are underinsured. So let's say you've got a property insurance here and you have $1 million coverage. Some people have $2 million coverage. Great. If something catastrophic happens in your property, which is what we're focusing on, well, $2 million isn't going to cut it. If somebody dies on your property or somebody has a significant injury and there's a $5, $10, $50 million claim, your $2 million insurance policy is not going to be there. The last thing, which is probably a little bit less likely, but it has happened before, is that you're getting an insurance from a company. If that company is not around at the time you make your claim, the insurance company obviously is not going to do you much good. So insurance is important. I encourage everyone to get it, but it does have its limitations, and I would never, ever rely exclusively on insurance for my asset protection plan. So if insurance has its limitations, how are we going to address the problem? Well, the answer is, if insurance is our first line of defense, we need some kind of a backstop in case insurance is not there, and that's when entity structuring comes into play. So going back to our original example of having you right here, and again, let's add a couple more assets here. Let's say you've got some rental property, you've got your car, I know, not the greatest picture. You've got some cash, you've got some stocks, maybe in the Dow Jones average. So let's say you've got these assets. And so one thing that many people think about is like, well, wait, why don't we put these in an entity? We put these in an entity so we remove the ownership, so we no longer own the assets, the entity owns the assets. The problem with this structure is that, remember, we're trying to create a barrier, is that if somebody sues you unrelated to your assets, you're in good shape because now they're going to try and get to your assets, but wait, you don't own the assets. Okay? You don't have ownership of these assets. You own an LLC or some kind of an entity, and if the entity is set up properly, and we'll talk about this in a few seconds, then you should be protected. The problem is, if something happens to your properties, remember the outside attack versus the inside attack, if something happens to your property, meaning a tenant slips and falls or has a catastrophic injury, or you get into a car accident here, or well, we had a business over here before, but let's say you have a business dispute, well now everything that's inside of this entity is exposed. So I can not only go, if something happens to my property, I can go after your vehicle, I can go after your cash, I can go after your businesses, I can go after your other properties. So what we need to do is really put these into their own separate entities. So that way, if something happens to one of your properties, again, the tenant slips and falls, or your boiler explodes, or something catastrophic happens, the exposure is limited to that one entity, typically an LLC when it comes to properties, whether it's one property. Some clients like to have 2 or 3 maybe properties inside that entity, but it's limited to what's inside there, which is typically the property itself or the asset itself. It won't spill over into your other assets. That way we've covered both an outside attack, meaning they can't get to your assets, but we've also covered the inside attack so that you're limited to whatever's inside that LLC, which is typically just the assets. One concept we have to address before moving on is probably one of the most important concepts in asset protection, and that is the charging order. And the charging order involves an outside attack. It has nothing to do with liability or exposures happening at the individual property level. It's simply a protection that you get from an outside attack, and let's just let's do a separate thing. So let's say you have, here's you again, and let's say you have some kind of an entity over here, which then owns, let's say you own a piece of property. Okay? What we're concerned about here is a situation where somebody sues you unrelated to your property. So there's a judgment for whatever reason. You got into a car accident, you ran into over the little lady. There's a judgment against you here. Okay, and so now your creditor is looking to collect on the property. Let's say the property is worth, $500,000, and creditor now has a judgment against you. They want to come after your $500,000. If this entity which owns the property is set up properly, then the creditor will not be able to get its hands on the LLC, or in this case it's going to be an LLC because it's a property, will not be able to get its hands on the LLC. It will not be able to control the LLC, because if they control the LLC, they can probably sell the property and then distribute it to themselves. All they're entitled to, under certain laws and certain jurisdictions, is what's called a charging order. And what a charging order means is whatever monies were coming up to you get diverted and go towards the creditor to pay off the debt. Again, can't take control of your property, can't sell it, can't do anything, but to the extent there are distributions from your entity to you, the creditor can go to the judge and ask for a charging order which says instead of the dollar coming to you, the dollar is going to go to the creditor. But here's the good part, or here's the fun part for us. The minute a charging order gets put into place, the first thing we're going to do is stop giving ourselves distributions. Like, why would you give yourself a distribution if that distribution is going to go directly to your creditor? So you create a scenario where even though the creditor has a judgment against you and is looking for a charging order, it's actually not getting any of the income or any of the distributions because you've cut those distributions off. And that puts you into a very strong bargaining position or negotiating positions to settle with this creditor because he's not going to see any money coming this way, he's not going to get his hands on the property, and that's why charging order protection is the backbone of any basic asset protection structure. So let's look at a specific example before we wrap it up here, and I'm going to use real estate because I know a lot of you guys have real estate investments. So let's say you own, let's just use two real estate rental properties for now. Let's say one in Texas and one in, let's use Georgia, since I know Atlanta is a pretty popular market these days. So again, a very basic structure here would be we would want to create an LLC here to own the Texas property. And typically we would create these in the state that they're located. So let's say a Texas. And we would create another one here for Georgia. Okay. And then typically for the charging order protection, again, Georgia and Texas may not be the best asset protection states out there. That just happens to be where your investment is, so that's where we kind of get stuck with that. But we can put a layer up here that makes sure that we are in a great state. Maybe it's, just an example that most people know of. Let's say a Nevada, for example, that does have a charging order protection. And so we will have the Nevada entity own the Texas entity and own the Georgia entity that then owns the properties. And then, of course, you own here. And so what we've done here effectively is, again, if something happens to the Texas property and somebody comes after you, then legally the owner of the property is legally responsible. So the owner of the property is the LLC. That's who has to respond. And so we're going to have first line of defense. We're going to have an insurance policy for this LLC. And if that doesn't cover it, then we've got the entity itself. And the only thing that's inside the entity is the property. So we only expose whatever equity is in this property. They can't go after Georgia. They can't come after whatever other assets they've got. Same with Georgia. If something happens to the Georgia one, they'll come after the Georgia LLC. You'll have an insurance policy in place. If that doesn't cover it, you've got the LLC in place. All they can come after, they're limited to whatever's inside that LLC, which is probably just going to be the property. On the other way, on an outside attack, if you run over the little old lady and they come after you and they want to come after your properties, well, guess what? You don't own the properties. You don't even own the LLCs that own the properties. You own this entity right here. And under the charging order laws that we explained just a little bit earlier, they're going to be limited to a charging order, which means they're only going to get the distributions that this LLC, this Nevada LLC, would have gone to you, will get diverted and go to them. But as you can see, they won't be able to get control of the property. They won't be able to sell the property. They really are limited in what they can do. And there you have it. Hope this was helpful for you guys in understanding some of the more basic asset protection concepts out there. Obviously, there's a lot more to it, but I really wanted you guys to get sort of a basic understanding of it. If you thought this was helpful for you guys, check out antilawyer.com. We put a lot of valuable stuff on there, and check us out.